Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. Today I'm going to talk about things in a slightly bigger way. Normally I focus in on a particular episode of history to do with America or China or India or Poland or something like that. Today I want to talk about really world history, world economic history throughout the 1970s, and why it is that much of the world transitioned from a period of economic growth and precedented period of economic growth from the end of the Second World War through to the late 1960s, through to a period of economic crisis which lasted throughout the 1970s and 1980s. There was a brief period of respite in the 1990s, and we're pretty much back in it now. So what is this bigger story all about? I intend in the next 20 minutes to try and investigate that a little bit. Hang on to the end, because there's the chance to get 10% off Audio Pie podcasts. Great for studying and great for learning and great for teaching. So hang on to the end and you'll hear all about that. But without further ado, let's talk about economic crisis. So any economic boom will slow down at some point. What normally tends to happen is that people spend large quantities of money and then they continue to do so. They consume, buying nice things, and then they borrow. And then the amount that they borrow eats into the disposable income, and then the spending power declines, and the amount that factories produce declines because shops are ordering less things, and so on and so forth. And you go from an inflationary to a deflationary moment. This is considered fairly normal. People pay off their debts and they start spending again. Hence, you have business cycles and economic cycles. However, in the 1970s, in Britain, America, and much of Europe, this doesn't happen. What happens is that at the same time you have deflation, i.e. the economies of the Western world slowing down and in some cases shrinking in size, you have no decrease in average prices. In fact, the recessions that the Western world face are also accompanied by inflation, which is normally symptomatic of an overheated economy. The economists have puzzled over why this happened, and the answer that was reached, particularly in Britain and America, was a monetarist answer. It was to do with excess money supply. There was too much money in the economy, and this monetarist economists said was really the fault of Keynesianism, of generous state spending throughout the post-war era, which had disrupted price signals in the economy. There are other more likely culprits than this, however, and we need to begin our story in 1971 with Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon in 1971 takes the dollar off the gold standard, off the fixed system of exchange rates. So the dollar is now no longer equivalent to an amount of gold. Instead, it becomes what we call a fiat currency, i.e. you can make as much of it as you like. It has no intrinsic value. And the devaluation is because America has spent a lot of money on Vietnam, fighting a war of attrition on the other side of the world over a long period of time. Has been extremely expensive, and America has had to borrow money in order to pay for the Vietnam War. And this meant that by taking the dollar off the gold standard, it became easier to repay America's debts. Now, the paradox here is that Nixon decided unilaterally to remove the dollar from the gold standard, and it meant that other European currencies, other, shall we say, first world currencies, had little choice but to follow suit. It wasn't what they wanted, but when the world's reserve currency abandons a system of exchange, the system of exchange tends to start to break down itself. The gold standard, which was the product of the Bretton Woods meetings of 1944, was an indication of how people like Keynes and his American counterparts saw the development of the post-war world. It was assumed that wealthy countries would become part of a fixed and stable monetary and exchange and trading system. And this system had lasted nicely for 3 decades, and now it was starting to break down. And there was no indication as to what would replace it. 2 years later, in Paris in 1973, Bretton Woods is consigned to the history books, and instead a floating system of exchange rates is born. And this creates huge new potentials for the financial industry and the ability to trade currency and speculate on currency. Something that really has a huge impact on every economy in the world today. Most of the currencies, particularly in Europe, were overvalued. The decline in value of currencies when they started to be traded on a floating exchange rate meant that prices rose, particularly for imports. Anybody wondering how this works, have a look back at everything that's happened since the Brexit referendum last summer, as the pound becomes a less desirable currency, prices rise because it costs more pounds to buy things from overseas. So this was one inflationary pressure on European countries. America, unfortunately, doesn't miss out on this inflationary pressure either. However, most governments believed that the decision to weather a little bit of inflation was no bad thing, and that a certain amount of inflation in the system was okay and manageable. It was better this than to allow recessions and to retreat from commitments to full employment and other aspects of the post-war social democratic consensus which had been dominant in much of the First World since the end of World War II. And it wasn't necessarily a terrible idea to permit a little bit of inflation into the system under sort of more favourable world conditions. It may well have just about worked. There is only one country in Western Europe that was deeply averse to price inflation, and that would have been before 1989, obviously, West Germany. Germany in 1923 experienced hyperinflation with catastrophic effects upon German democratic life. A decade later, throttling it entirely. But a huge amount of power had now been handed to international currency traders, people buying and selling currencies. There was no regulation of them. The previous monetary systems, internationally agreed and nationally enforced, allowed for strict currency controls, i.e. the preventing of people from leaving the country with large amounts of currency which could potentially be destabilising. So price inflation on commodities increased between 1971 and 1973. The world price of non-fuel commodities increased by 70% and food by 100%. This was a crisis already before the two oil shocks of the 1970s. So in October 1973, the Yom Kippur War, the Third Arab-Israeli War, happened, and within a day, oil exporting countries had, mainly Arab oil exporting countries, I should add, had announced in response to America's decision to back Israel had announced plans to reduce oil production and therefore push up the price. The king of Saudi Arabia had said to Richard Nixon, "Time for America to sit this one out. It's time for the Arab nations to fight unhandicapped Israel." And the war, which finishes with an Egyptian-Israeli ceasefire at the end of October, on the 25th of October, has long-lasting consequences for European countries. The Arab frustration for Israel, for Western backing of Israel, leads to a decision to continue putting the price of oil up and decreasing supply. And so by Christmas 1973, the cost of oil had doubled since the start of the year, which creates a huge shock to the European and American economies. It should be noted, obviously, at the time, that the Soviet Union was assisting the Syrians and Egyptians with arms. So the idea that the American support for Israel was completely one-sided is perhaps a little disingenuous. The price of oil hadn't changed since the 1940s in comparative terms. So the long period of prosperity had seen low oil prices, and they had been founded on low oil prices. In the case of America, particularly, the development of towns and cities and the growth of suburbia was based on cheap oil. The moment that it costs an unsustainable amount to drive from suburban conurbations on the outskirts of American cities, long journeys into the city, it means that suburbia is thrown into crisis. The 1970s and 1980s, and indeed 1990s, produce all sorts of kind of culture surrounded, all sorts of kind of movies and TV shows and novels about suburban crisis. And it's partly the economic underpinnings of suburbia are profoundly shaken by the oil shock. Oil, if anything, had actually, in real terms, got cheaper throughout the 50s and the 60s, because of almost negligible inflation. And because of this, oil had gradually replaced solid fuels. So coal and coke and that kind of thing had become uncompetitive when faced with the cheapness of oil in terms of, particularly of heating and electricity and power. So you can see the dependency of Western European societies on oil as a fossil fuel. And when the price of oil dramatically increases, so does the price of transportation, electricity and energy, power, and everything based on that, agriculture, food, you name it. Oil production in Great Britain from North Sea oil had only begun in 1971. And so there wasn't really long enough for Britain to become self-sufficient on oil, and perhaps not in the quantities that were needed. And of course, in Europe and America, the exacerbating factor throughout this period of time were growing populations and obviously a consumer boom, which made cheap oil a far more essential commodity, mainly to power the tens of millions of new cars which had found their way onto the new roads and highways of Europe, and had become the ultimate status symbol of post-war affluence. One thing that was lost with the end of fixed exchange rates was a predictability in prices. As currencies move up and down on a floating exchange rate, you get ever-increasing price volatility, and the economic pressures of the 1970s pushed prices only in one direction. Now, it must be remembered that not only had countries like Great Britain experienced an oil shock and the problem of the end of the gold standard, but Britain particularly had experienced creeping inflation throughout the 1960s as Britain failed to invest sufficiently in new industries and failed to deal with the industrial problems that it faced. Inflation was a sign of poor competitiveness and poor productivity. Low productivity has been really Britain's post-war great nightmare, really, and poor productivity and poor industrial relations were again exacerbated by inflation that forced workers to compete for higher wage claims and to strike for higher wage claims. And thus Britain had this reputation for being a country riven with industrial unrest and economic problems. The reality, actually, in the 1960s and 1970s is that more strike days were lost in the USA, in Italy, in France, in Japan, and in Canada than were lost per year in Great Britain. So the image doesn't always portray the reality. To give you an indication of inflation throughout the 1970s, during the 60s, the OECD figures were that inflation across Western Europe was at 3.1%, fairly steady throughout the decade. From 69 to 73, it was 6.4%, so effectively more than doubles. And then it doubles again from 73 to 79 at 11.9%. There are obviously variations. West Germany managed to have a reasonable inflation rate of 4.7%, which would be considered extremely high by today's standards. French inflation averaged at 10.7%, but it's Great Britain that just comes in under Italy at 15.6%. Italy is 16.1%. And in 1975, the inflation shoots up to 24%. The problem with this kind of inflation is that it had never really been seen before. Inflation previously was the sign of an overheating economy, or where production had spending had dramatically outpaced productivity. There's too much money whizzing around the economy, or a creation of an overprinting of currency, such as with Weimar Germany in 1923. This was a commodity commodity-based inflation, where the commodity price of a raw material like oil is artificially forced up, and it indicates an over-reliance on a particular energy source, which is largely, unfortunately, unavoidable. There's a second oil shock in 1979 when the Iranian Revolution happens and the Shah of Iran is overthrown by the Ayatollah Khomeini. And from 1979 to 1980, once again, prices soar upwards. The term that economists used to describe the phenomena of inflation and low growth in the 1970s, therefore, was called stagflation, stagnation and inflation. It wasn't, again, to make it distinct from the inflation that is born of a overheating economy, and one which really more accurately reflected the times. The thing about the 1970s that always has to be remembered is that across Western Europe and the USA, even though inflation is eating away at living standards, in most cases, in most countries, people enjoy a better standard of living in 1979 than they do in 1969. And the fact that the 70s is viewed as such an apocalyptic economic time, I mean, it doesn't bear much comparison with the 1930s, for example. The reason why it's viewed as such a dark time economically is partly because it's compared to the previous 2 decades, the 50s and 60s, which were eras of low prices, relatively high wages, and full employment. And it's those decades, the 50s and 60s, that are the real anomaly here. If you compare the growth rates of Great Britain at about 1.3% throughout the 1970s to the growth rates of Britain between 1914 and 1950, they're roughly comparable. And the growth rates that Britain has in the 50s and 60s, about 3%, which you can compare to the growth rates of France and Germany, 5 and 6% during the 50s and 60s as well. These are, aberrations. The final thing to remember about the 1970s is that it was a decade where America and Europe recognised a full economic recovery from Asia, from countries like Taiwan, Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, and later, obviously, in the 1980s and 90s, China becomes the great tiger economy, largely by following the example of the new capitalist economies on its borders. And this puts an additional pressure on domestic manufacturing in Europe and America, and this has obviously a knock-on effect on employment. By the end of the 1970s, the employment rate is 7% in France, 8% in Italy, and 9% in Great Britain. So these are staggering figures. And in Britain from 1979 onwards, with the advent of Thatcherism, unemployment rates soared still higher, coming close to the 3 million mark in the early 1980s. Many commentators argue that in Britain, the solution to stagflation was Thatcherism, and this is largely true. However, it needs to be seen in a slightly different perspective as well, in that from 1976 onwards, the Labour Chancellor, Denis Healey, abandoned most of the main trappings of the post-war consensus 3 years before Margaret Thatcher was even in office, the commitment to full employment being the chief one. And the reason for this is the decision by Great Britain to access an IMF loan. The loan came with conditions such as the privatisation and the selling off of public assets in order to make Britain a more competitive country, a more financially sound country, so the theory goes. This is, by the way, the thinking of the generation of monetarists who had been chipping away since the 1950s, and their time had really come. And the monetarist economists argued that the real essence of bringing down inflation and thus returning the country to productivity was to reduce the money supply at any cost. This is tried in the early 1980s by Geoffrey Howe, Margaret Thatcher's Chancellor, and is a dismal failure. So, to conclude, the conditions that created inflation and economic decline in the 1970s across much of the wealthy world, and there is a whole other story to talk about the communist world during the 1970s. We haven't got the scope to do that now. These were long-term structural problems such as productivity in places like Great Britain and industrial relations, and the short-term reaction to oil shocks. And it's something that it takes the economies of the Western world the best part of 20 years to manage to get themselves out of. And this is why, why we have fond memories of the 1990s. One of the many reasons why we look back on that as a halcyon era, because many of these crises seem to be in abeyance for the most part. and that is what gives us this view of the 1990s that's popularly held as being this kind of wonderful post-historical decade. Okay, so that's everything on inflation for today and probably for the foreseeable future. I think we've all had enough of that. I'm talking about money. If you want to get your 10% off Audio Pie podcasts, hold on, and here comes our amazing advert.
The mist of a November dawn doesn't shroud the smell of mud, dried sweat, or the latrine. Yet there's something different in the air. Silence. The guns have stopped. So's the shouting. What next? Welcome to AudioPie's GCSE series on Germany between 1919 and 1945. During this series,
to find out more, go to www.audiopie.co.uk and quote the promo code EXPLAIN when you get to the checkout. AudioPie, inspiring education.